Most people think of basements as background spaces. They're not where life happens. They're where things are stored, forgotten, or ignored. But that's exactly what makes them unsettling. When something feels wrong down there, it doesn't announce itself. It waits. It blends into the quiet hum of the house above, slowly turning a familiar space into something you don't want to go back to. Tonight, these are 3 true stories sent in by people who went into their basements expecting nothing out of the ordinary and came back with memories that still don't sit right. This story was sent in by Mark, and it happened while he was living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. Mark had just moved back into his childhood home after finishing college. His parents had recently downsized and moved out of state, leaving the house empty for almost a year. When Mark returned, everything felt strangely familiar, like time had barely moved at all. The same creaky wooden stairs, the same narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms. Even the air inside the house smelled the same as it did when he was younger. The basement was unfinished, just like he remembered. It was mostly used for storage when his parents lived there. Old furniture, cardboard boxes, paint cans, and seasonal decorations filled the shelves along the walls. As a kid, Mark never liked going down there alone, but as an adult, he didn't think much of it anymore. One afternoon, a few days after moving back in, Mark realized the weather was getting colder. He remembered that most of his winter clothes were still packed away somewhere in the basement. It seemed like a simple task: go down, grab a box, and come back up. The light switch was located at the top of the stairs, just inside the basement door. When he flipped it, the light came on immediately. A single exposed bulb illuminated the room with a dull yellow glow. The shadows it cast were long and uneven, but nothing about it felt unusual at first. As Mark stepped down the stairs, he felt calm, almost nostalgic. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor. For a moment, it felt like he was walking back into a memory rather than a place. The basement looked exactly the same as it always had. Concrete floors with small cracks, exposed wooden beams overhead, metal shelves lining the walls, stacked with dusty boxes and old containers. Nothing appeared broken, nothing looked damaged. That sense of comfort didn't last long. As Mark walked toward the back wall where the clothing boxes were usually kept, he noticed something subtle but wrong. One section of shelving didn't look the way he remembered it. The boxes there weren't stacked neatly like the others. Some were turned sideways, a few were placed directly on the floor, as if someone had been sorting through them and never finished. At first, Mark assumed his parents had moved things around before leaving. Even though they had told him they barely touched the basement, it seemed like the most reasonable explanation. He didn't want to overthink it. He began opening boxes, checking labels, moving items aside. As he did, he started noticing small details that made him pause. Near the center of the basement was a folding chair. It was unfolded. It was positioned facing the bottom of the stairs. Mark stood still for a moment, staring at it. He tried to remember if that chair had always been there. He remembered folding chairs being stored down here, but always stacked and folded against the wall, not opened, not placed like that. The longer he looked at it, the more certain he became that chair had not been there before. Trying to shake the feeling, Mark called out, half joking, asking if anyone was there. His voice sounded louder than he expected in the low-ceilinged space. The sound echoed slightly, then faded. Nothing answered. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Old house, old memories. His mind was filling in gaps that didn't exist. He turned back to the boxes and continued searching. But the longer he stayed down there, the more uncomfortable he felt. It wasn't fear exactly. His heart wasn't racing. His breathing stayed normal. It was a quiet sense of being watched, like someone was nearby, just out of sight, standing perfectly still. He tried to ignore it. He focused on the task. Finally, he found the box labeled with his winter clothes. Relief washed over him as he closed the lid and picked it up. When he turned back toward the stairs, his stomach tightened. The chair had moved. It was no longer in the center of the room. It was closer now, only a few feet from the bottom step. Mark froze. He knew he hadn't touched it. He hadn't heard anything move. The basement had been completely silent the entire time. For a few seconds, he just stood there, holding the box, listening. The hum of the light bulb above him sounded louder than before. His ears strained for any sound, breathing, footsteps, anything. There was nothing. Mark didn't run. He didn't want to. Something about running felt wrong, like it would confirm that something truly was there. Instead, he walked up the stairs slowly, one step at a time, never turning his back completely on the room. At the top, he reached out, switched off the light, and closed the basement door behind him. That night, before going to bed, Mark checked the basement door again. He realized it wasn't locked. He didn't remember unlocking it. He locked the door and pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it, just to be safe. After that day, Mark avoided the basement whenever possible. If he needed something from down there, he waited until someone else was home. Sometimes he just decided it wasn't worth it at all. Years later, when he thinks back on it, he says the most unsettling part wasn't the chair moving. It was the realization that someone had been down there long enough to sit, wait, and get comfortable. This one was sent in by Alicia, who was living alone in a small apartment building in Northern California. The building was older, but it was still considered safe and well-maintained. It had 3 floors, narrow hallways, and thin walls, the kind of place where you could hear doors close, footsteps above you, and televisions playing through the walls at night. The basement was shared by everyone in the building and used only as a laundry room. There was no storage down there, no bikes, no boxes, no personal items at all. Just washing machines, dryers, exposed pipes along the ceiling, and a locked maintenance room at the far end of the space. The walls were bare concrete. The floor was always cold. The ceiling was low enough that taller people had to be careful. Fluorescent lights ran across the room and buzzed constantly. They were never fully silent, even when nothing else was happening. The machines were old. They rattled, they shook, they made loud, uneven noises, even with small loads. Alicia had used that laundry room for years, so none of it felt strange to her anymore. Normally, she did her laundry during the day, usually on weekends. She liked knowing that other tenants might be nearby. It made the basement feel less isolated. But one week, her work schedule changed. She didn't get home until late. Around 10 p.m., she realized she had no clean clothes left for the next day. She thought about waiting, but eventually decided to go down to the basement anyway. It didn't feel dangerous. Other tenants sometimes did laundry late at night. The building was quiet, but it wasn't empty. When Alicia opened the basement door, she immediately noticed how still the air felt. None of the machines were running. The usual background noise was gone. Without it, the room felt larger, emptier. The buzzing lights seemed louder than normal. She walked over to a washer, loaded her clothes, poured in detergent and started the cycle. The sound of water filling the machine felt oddly comforting. It broke the silence. She sat down on one of the plastic chairs against the wall and scrolled through her phone while she waited. Minutes passed. Everything felt normal. Then she heard footsteps. They were quiet, slow, measured. The sound came from the far end of the basement, near the maintenance room. Alicia assumed another tenant had come down to do laundry. She didn't look up right away. There was no reason to. The footsteps continued for a moment. Then they stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Something about it made her look up. Near the maintenance door stood a man she had never seen before. He wasn't holding a laundry basket. He wasn't carrying detergent. He wasn't reading any signs or checking the machines. He was just standing there, facing her. Alicia felt a tight feeling in her chest. She told herself not to panic. She gave a small, polite smile and looked back down at her phone, hoping he would move. The washer continued running. The lights continued buzzing. The man did not move. Seconds passed, then minutes. The feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Alicia stood up and walked toward her dryer, pretending to check the settings. She wanted to show that she was aware of him without saying anything. When she turned back toward the room, her stomach sank. The man was closer, much closer than before. He hadn't made a sound, no footsteps, no movement she could hear. He was still completely silent, still watching her. She asked if he needed something. Her voice echoed slightly in the open space. She could hear it shaking, even though she tried to sound calm. He didn't answer. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly raised his arm. He pointed toward the back hallway. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit. It led away from the laundry room and toward a series of old storage rooms that tenants were not allowed to use. Alicia had never gone down there. No one ever did. The man kept pointing, his arm steady, his expression empty. Alicia didn't respond. She didn't ask any questions. She grabbed her laundry basket, even though her clothes were still wet, and walked toward the stairs. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She focused only on leaving the basement. Once she reached her apartment, she locked the door and sat down on her couch. She stayed there for a long time, listening to normal sounds. Footsteps, doors, a television playing nearby. The next morning, Alicia told her landlord what had happened. He listened carefully, but looked confused. He told her there had been no maintenance workers scheduled that night, no inspections, no repairs. When she asked about the security cameras in the basement, he hesitated before admitting they had been broken for months. After that, Alicia stopped using the basement laundry room completely. She started going to a laundromat a few blocks away, even though it cost more and took more time. Even now, she says what unsettles her the most is not the silence. It is the feeling that he already knew which hallway people avoided and why. This last story was sent in by Daniel, and it happened at his grandmother's rural home in West Virginia. His grandmother lived far from town, surrounded by trees and open land, with no nearby neighbors and no streetlights. At night, the area became extremely quiet, the kind of quiet where even small sounds felt louder than they should. The house had been in the family for generations. It was old but well cared for, with floors that creaked slightly and walls that made soft noises when the temperature changed. Daniel had spent many weekends there growing up, and nothing about the place had ever felt unsafe to him. Instead of a basement, the house had a storm cellar. The cellar was detached from the house and partially underground, set into the yard a short distance from the back porch. A heavy metal door covered the entrance, opening upward to reveal a narrow stairway leading down into the earth. Daniel was visiting for a weekend in the fall. The weather had cooled, the leaves were beginning to change color, and everything about the visit felt normal and familiar. One evening, just before dinner, his grandmother casually asked him to grab a jar of canned vegetables from the storm cellar. She said it like it was nothing. Daniel didn't argue. He had gone down there before, many times, and it had never been an issue. He stepped outside as the daylight began to fade. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of soil and leaves. The yard was quiet except for distant insects. Daniel grabbed the handle of the storm cellar door and lifted. The metal was heavier than it looked and made a low sound as it opened, echoing faintly across the yard. Inside, a single exposed light bulb hung from the ceiling and turned on automatically. It swayed slightly as the door opened, causing the shadows along the walls to move slowly. The smell inside the cellar was strong, damp earth, rust, and old metal. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with glass jars, old tools, and containers that looked like they had not been touched in years, all coated in a thin layer of dust. As Daniel stepped down onto the dirt floor, his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that was when he noticed something near the back wall. The dirt did not look natural. It was not dug up or scattered, but uneven and pressed down in places, like something heavy had been dragged slowly across it. He stopped moving and stared at it for several seconds. He tried to explain it to himself. Maybe his grandmother had moved something heavy. Maybe the ground had shifted over time. Maybe it had always looked that way, and he had just never paid attention before. Still, the feeling did not go away. He grabbed the jar his grandmother asked for and left the cellar, closing the door behind him. When Daniel returned to the house, he mentioned what he had seen. He asked his grandmother about the dirt floor and the marks near the wall. She paused before answering, not for long, just long enough for him to notice. Then she told him not to worry about it. She said the ground sometimes shifted, especially after rain. Her voice sounded calm and normal, so Daniel didn't push the issue, even though the pause stayed in his mind. Dinner continued like nothing had happened. That night, Daniel went to bed in the guest room. The window faced the backyard, and from his bed he could see the outline of trees against the dark sky. The house was quiet, and for a while he slept. Some time later, he woke up without knowing why. Then he heard it, metal scraping against metal, slow, steady, and repeating. The sound was faint but clear enough to recognize. Daniel sat up and listened. It was coming from outside, from the direction of the storm cellar. He got out of bed and walked to the window. The storm cellar door was open. The light inside was on. The dull glow from the bulb spilled out onto the ground, illuminating the underside of the metal door and part of the yard. Daniel stood there watching. He did not see anyone. He did not hear footsteps, just the quiet hum of the light and the occasional sound of metal settling. After a while, the scraping sound stopped, but the light stayed on. Daniel eventually went back to bed, though sleep did not come easily. In the morning, he asked his grandmother about the cellar again. This time, her answer was different. She admitted she had not been using the storm cellar for years. She said most of the jars down there were old, some from before Daniel was even born. She did not explain why the door had been open, and she did not explain why the light was on. They left early that day to visit family in town, and the conversation never came up again. Daniel never asked who had been going down into the storm cellar. He says the reason is simple. The answer felt worse than the question.